What we're witnessing in Texas right now is something quite extraordinary, and I think it's important we understand the full implications of what's actually happening here. The confrontation that's unfolded between federal authority, state sovereignty, and public dissent isn't simply about one protest or one response. It goes much deeper than that. This is about the fundamental tension in American governance that's been simmering beneath the surface for years, and it's now erupting in ways that will reshape the political landscape for the foreseeable future. The Trump administration's response to demonstrations in Texas has triggered a constitutional debate that touches on everything from executive power to states' rights, from freedom of assembly to the question of who truly holds authority when federal and state interests collide. And what's particularly significant here is the timing coming at a moment when America's global credibility, its economic strategy, and its internal cohesion are all being tested simultaneously. This isn't happening in isolation. The world is watching how America handles dissent within its own borders, especially as it continues to position itself as the arbiter of democratic values internationally. So let's examine exactly what happened, why it matters, and what the consequences might be. Now, to understand what's really happening in Texas, we need to step back and look at the broader context because nothing in politics happens in a vacuum, and this situation is no exception. Texas has always occupied a unique position in American political consciousness. It's not just another state, it's a state with its own distinct identity, its own sense of sovereignty, and a population that has historically been very protective of what they see as their constitutional rights and their independence from federal overreach. This is a state that was once its own republic, and that history, that memory, still resonates very deeply in the political culture there. So when we see confrontations between federal authority and what's happening on the ground in Texas, we're not just looking at a simple question of law enforcement or protest management. We're looking at something that taps into much deeper currents in American political life. The protests that erupted in Texas didn't come out of nowhere. They're the result of accumulated frustrations, policy disagreements, and a sense among certain segments of the population that their voices aren't being heard, that their concerns aren't being addressed, and that the direction the country is taking under the Trump administration is fundamentally at odds with their values and their vision for America. Now, whether you agree with the protesters or not, whether you think their concerns are legitimate or misguided, the fact is that protest is a protected right under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. This is fundamental, the right to peacefully assemble, to petition the government for redress of grievances. These aren't peripheral aspects of American democracy, they're absolutely central to it. And any response to protest that appears to infringe upon these rights immediately raises very serious constitutional questions. What makes this situation particularly volatile is the nature of the Trump administration's response. Now, we've seen over the years that Donald Trump has a very particular style when it comes to handling dissent and opposition. He tends to view challenges to his authority or his policies not as legitimate democratic expression, but as threats that need to be dealt with forcefully. This isn't new. We saw it during his first term, and we're seeing it again now. But what's different this time is the context in which it's happening. The country is more polarized than it's been in decades, perhaps since the Civil War era. The institutional checks and balances that are supposed to moderate executive power have been weakened over time through various means, and there's a general sense of instability, both domestically and internationally, that makes every confrontation feel more consequential, more dangerous, more likely to spiral into something larger. When federal forces were deployed to Texas to deal with these protests, it immediately raised alarm bells for people across the political spectrum who understand the implications of using federal power in this way. There's a very delicate balance in the American system between federal authority and state authority, and when that balance is upset, When the federal government is seen to be intervening in state affairs in ways that appear heavy-handed or politically motivated, it creates a crisis of legitimacy. The governor of Texas found himself in an extremely difficult position. Does he cooperate with federal authorities and risk alienating his own base, or does he resist and potentially escalate the situation into a full-blown constitutional crisis? These aren't easy choices, and they're exactly the kind of choices that leaders hope they never have to make. What we're also seeing here is a test of American institutions more broadly. The courts will inevitably be drawn into this, and we'll see legal challenges that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. The question of whether the federal government overstepped its authority, whether the response was proportional to any legitimate threat, whether constitutional rights were violated. These are questions that will be litigated extensively, and the answers to these questions will have implications far beyond this particular incident. They'll set precedents for how future administrations can respond to domestic dissent, for what limits exist on executive power, for how the balance between security and liberty is struck in moments of tension. But let's also consider the international dimension of all this, because, as I mentioned earlier, nothing happens in isolation. The United States has positioned itself for decades as the global champion of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. American leaders have lectured other countries about how they handle protests, about respecting civil liberties, about the importance of democratic norms and institutions, when those same principles appear to be under strain within the United States itself, when we see images of federal forces confronting American citizens engaged in what they claim is peaceful protest, it undermines American credibility on the world stage. Countries that the United States has criticized for their handling of domestic dissent, China, Russia, Iran, and others, are already seizing on this situation to point out what they see as American hypocrisy. They're using it in their own propaganda to deflect from criticism of their own practices. And allies of the United States, countries in Europe and elsewhere that have traditionally looked to America for leadership on democratic values, are watching with concern and wondering whether the United States can still credibly claim that leadership role. There's also an economic dimension to all this that often gets overlooked in the immediate drama of events. Texas is not just politically significant, it's economically crucial to the United States. It's a major center for energy production, for technology, for manufacturing, for agriculture. When there's instability in Texas, when there's a confrontation between state and federal authority that creates uncertainty about governance and the rule of law, it affects investor confidence, it affects business decisions, it affects the flow of capital and commerce. We live in a globalized economy where perception matters enormously, where stability and predictability are valued by markets, and where any sign of internal conflict in a major economy like the United States sends ripples through the entire system. The business community in Texas and beyond is watching this situation very carefully because they need to understand what kind of environment they're operating in, what risks they might face, and how secure their investments and operations really are. Now, let's talk about the question of federal power and how it's being exercised in this case. The use of federal forces for domestic law enforcement is not something that's done lightly in the American system, or at least it shouldn't be. There are very specific legal frameworks that govern when and how federal forces can be deployed within the United States, and these frameworks exist for good reason. The Posse Comitatus Act, for instance, generally prohibits the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement purposes. There are exceptions to this, of course. The Insurrection Act allows the President to deploy military forces under certain circumstances, but invoking these authorities is a serious step that carries significant legal and political implications. The question that many legal scholars and political observers are asking is whether the situation in Texas actually met the threshold for federal intervention, whether the legal justifications that were offered are sound, and whether there might have been alternative approaches that could have de-escalated rather than escalated the situation. What's particularly concerning to many observers is the rhetoric that's accompanied the federal response when protest is characterized as insurrection, when dissent is framed as a threat to national security, when citizens exercising their constitutional rights are portrayed as enemies of the state. It creates a very dangerous dynamic. It polarizes the situation even further, it makes compromise and de-escalation more difficult, and it sets a precedent for how future dissent might be handled. Throughout American history, there have been moments when the government overreacted to protest movements, when it characterized legitimate democratic expression as dangerous subversion, and those moments are generally not remembered proudly. The surveillance and disruption of the civil rights movement, the response to anti-war protests during the Vietnam era, the treatment of labor organizers in earlier periods, these are all examples of times when the government's response to dissent went too far and violated the very principles it claimed to be protecting. The media's role in all of this is also worth examining carefully. We're living in an era of deeply fragmented media, where different segments of the population consume entirely different information ecosystems and come away with completely different understandings of reality. Some media outlets are portraying the Texas protests as dangerous mob violence that threatened public safety and required a strong federal response. Others are portraying them as peaceful democratic expression that was met with authoritarian repression. The truth, as is often the case, is probably somewhere in the complex middle, but that nuanced truth is very difficult to communicate in an environment where every story gets filtered through partisan lenses and where the incentive structure of modern media favors dramatic narratives over careful analysis. This fragmentation makes it much harder for Americans to have a shared understanding of what's actually happening, which in turn makes it harder to have productive conversations about how to address the underlying issues. And what are those underlying issues? This is crucial because if we just focus on the immediate confrontation, on who did what and when, and whether it was legal or justified, we miss the deeper currents that produced this situation in the first place. The protests in Texas, like protests we've seen elsewhere in recent years, are symptoms of broader anxieties and frustrations in American society. There's anxiety about economic security, about whether the American dream is still achievable for ordinary people, about whether the next generation will have the opportunities that previous generations had. There's frustration about political polarization, about the sense that the country is coming apart, that Americans can no longer talk to each other across ideological divides, that compromise has become impossible. There's concern about America's role in the world, about whether the country is overextended, about whether foreign commitments are coming at the expense of domestic needs. And there are deep disagreements about values, about what kind of society America should be, about whose vision for the country's future should prevail. These are not easy issues to address, and they can't be solved through force or repression. They require genuine engagement, genuine dialogue, genuine attempts to find common ground and build consensus. But that kind of engagement is extremely difficult in the current political environment, where trust in institutions is low, where political leaders are incentivized to cater to their bases rather than reach across divides, and where the structural features of the political system, gerrymandering, the electoral college, the way Senate seats are distributed, mean that political power doesn't always align with public opinion in straightforward ways. The confrontation in Texas is a symptom of these deeper dysfunctions, and until those dysfunctions are addressed, we're likely to see more such confrontations, more instability, more polarization. Looking ahead, there are several scenarios for how this situation could develop. In the best case, cooler heads prevail. There's some form of negotiated resolution, the immediate crisis passes, and the various parties step back from the brink. Legal challenges work their way through the courts in an orderly fashion, and whatever precedents emerge from those challenges provide clearer guidance for future situations. Political leaders on both sides recognize that continued escalation serves no one's interests and find ways to de-escalate. This would be the optimistic scenario, but it requires a degree of restraint and wisdom that has been in short supply in recent American politics. In a more pessimistic scenario, the situation escalates further. More protests erupt, not just in Texas but in other states as well, as people react to what they see as federal overreach. State governments face increasing pressure to choose sides, to either cooperate with federal authorities or resist them, and that choice creates cascading effects throughout the federal system. The courts get drawn into an increasingly politicized conflict, and their rulings, whatever they are, satisfy no one and are seen by different segments of the population as either legitimate or illegitimate, based purely on whether they align with their political preferences. International observers become more concerned about American stability, and that concern translates into economic and diplomatic consequences. This scenario doesn't necessarily mean civil war or state secession. Those remain extreme and unlikely outcomes, but it does mean a prolonged period of instability, uncertainty, and institutional strain that weakens the United States, both domestically and internationally. The reality is that the American political system is under stress in ways that it hasn't been for a very long time. The norms and informal rules that have historically kept conflicts within manageable bounds have eroded. The shared sense of national identity and common purpose that once helped Americans navigate their differences has fractured. The economic foundation that once allowed most Americans to feel they had a stake in the system and reason to believe in its continued functioning has become shakier for many people. And in this context, incidents like what we're seeing in Texas become not just isolated events, but potential triggers for larger breakdowns. This is why careful analysis is so important, why understanding the full context and all the dimensions of what's happening matters so much. We can't afford to view these events through purely partisan lenses or to reduce them to simple narratives of good versus evil. The reality is complex, the stakes are high, and the choices that leaders and citizens make in response to situations like this will shape the trajectory of American democracy for years to come. What's clear is that the United States is at a crossroads. The confrontation in Texas is forcing fundamental questions about power, rights, federalism, and democracy into the open in ways that can't be ignored. How these questions are answered, both in the immediate term through the resolution of this particular crisis and in the longer term through political, legal, and social processes, will determine what kind of country America becomes in the decades ahead. Will it be a country that lives up to its stated ideals of liberty, democracy, and the rule of law, or will it be a country where those ideals are increasingly rhetorical rather than real, where power is exercised without adequate constraint, where dissent is suppressed rather than engaged? These aren't abstract questions, they're being answered right now through concrete actions and decisions. And that's why what's happening in Texas matters so profoundly, not just for Texans or for Americans, but for everyone who has an interest in whether democratic governance can survive and thrive in the 21st century. The world is watching, history is being written, and the choices being made today will echo for a very long time indeed.